Hi, I'm Hennepin County Attorney Mary Moriarty. Welcome to our podcast, We Don't Have to Choose. I'm really excited about today's episode because we are going to be talking about how we expanded youth diversion based on research and studies about what actually works for public safety. This is a perfect topic for We Don't Have to Choose because, as we will learn through this podcast, the outcomes are much better when we expand our approach to diversion. So we're going to be hearing from Dr. Kara Beckman, who worked with us from the University of Minnesota to look at what our cases look like in the last 10 years. We're going to talk to Jillian Deese, who's the manager of our Youth Prosecution Division, and we're going to talk to Chris Guy, one of our diversion providers. So welcome to this episode. Hi, I'm here with Kara Beckman, who has done tremendous research with us that really led to some of our changes with youth diversion. Hi, Kara.
Hi, Mary. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. Can you introduce yourself?
Sure. So I am an applied researcher at the Center for Health Youth Development at the University of Minnesota. We're actually in the medical school in the Department of Pediatrics. And we, for our 40-year history, have partnered with people who work with youth to get better outcomes for young people and their families. And really particular to this partnership, we have for about almost 20 years now partnered around the idea of getting better outcomes from our accountability practices. So whether that's at school or in things that happen in community or things that come into contact with prosecutors' offices through law enforcement, really applying developmental science to figure out what kind of accountability practices get better outcomes.
So can you talk about your work with our office at the Hennepin County Attorney's Office? We've actually worked together before, but we here today are talking about the diversion project. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so that, I think in 2024 is when we officially launched that, and it really had three kind of core components or outcomes we were looking for. And the first one was to look at your data historically, the data from this office and the diversion practices that had been in use from 2016 to 2023, and figure out what kind of outcomes we were getting from that. And then the second aspect was to compare what you were doing and the outcomes you were getting to what we've learned over the past 30 years around developmental science, and figure out whether we thought we could kind of outperform those outcomes if we revamped the diversion program. So to really help you and provide some recommendations on what a more effective diversion policy and practice might look like. And then finally, to set up and help you set up metrics that you all could track going forward so that you could continue this kind of public accountability and transparency to say, look, here are the outcomes we're getting from this new model.
So I want to go back and dig deeper a little bit into some of the things that you said. First, this project was with the Hennepin County Attorney's Office. It was with our youth prosecution team.
Yeah.
And those are young people that can be prosecuted criminally. We call it delinquency, but that would be ages 10 to 17. That's going to change August 1st to 13 to 17. But this particular group we're talking about ages 10 to 17, and you went back and looked at about 10 years worth of data?
Yeah, it was specifically 8 years of data. It ended up being about 21,000 cases that were nested among 11,000 individual youth, approximately.
And then we were talking about diversion, and people get quite confused about what that is. Can you talk about diversion in the context of the research that you did?
Yeah, so diversion broadly can mean any kind of off-ramp from the traditional court system model. So police can do diversion, prosecutors can do diversion, and it really often includes some kind of community-centered approach to addressing what came into contact with your office rather than the traditional systems approach. And part of that is because we've been learning over time that we're really not getting good outcomes from the traditional systems approach. That system was developed in the 1890s. And the science we have now about young people is really different than what we knew in the 1890s. But systems are slow to catch up. and community is more flexible and responsive. And so kind of the approach has been, let's use community more often because they get better outcomes. And so particularly in Hennepin County, diversion looked like, and a pretty traditional model is, certain offenses go to community for somewhat prescriptive models. Like if you have a drug offense, you go to kind of the, drug, providers who can provide some education and intervention related to drug offenses.
In other words, when prosecutor's office divert cases, part of that is usually some type of community programming.
Yeah, exactly. Often, although there's also informal diversion that doesn't necessarily include official programming, and that can be because we just trust that parents can handle this kind of behavior. It might be illegal, but it's also common among young people. It's a really core aspect of developmental science, is to understand how normative risk-taking is at this age, and that there's lots and lots of behaviors that parents and community handle all the time without legal system intervention. And some of that is illegal, and sometimes it comes to a prosecutor's office, and a prosecutor can use the discretion to say, we don't think this needs a big system response. And so there's informal diversion where you just kind of trust the family to do it. And then there's more programming focused diversion where a community social service provider, restorative justice provider, behavioral health provider really seeks to, kind of understand that behavior in the context of the youth and family's needs.
And what you said about us having discretion and in some cases letting the parent deal with it or take care of it, it turns out your research, and we're going to talk about that, says a lot about the harm that the system does in bringing young people in. And I do want to talk about that. But my entire career has been in the system, and I know our traditional approach is kind of this incremental accountability, punishment, whatever you would call it. So and we do this with adults too. Somebody comes in on a first-time offense, and if it's a property drug offense, maybe we do diversion. But then if you come back, you get offered what might be called a stay of imposition or a stay of execution, so probation. And then every time you come back, there's some kind of step up in accountability. And the mindset there is that, I'm not entirely sure what the mindset is there, but just, I think it's an example of how systems tend to do the things that they've always done without really looking at the data and research to see what works. And we can see reflected in recidivism data and the data that we see from probation outcomes that recidivism is extremely high. And so what we're doing clearly isn't working.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think to get at your kind of wondering about what the mindset is that justifies that is, back to like 1890s versus 1990s and what we know. What we know now is that behavior, especially in youth and emerging adults, behavior is a communication of needs. And so that, to respond to increasing and escalating behavior with increasing and escalating punishments harkens back to a day when all we could do to make meaning of that kind of behavior is say this is a character problem. And so this young person needs more punishment because, their character is flawed. And what we know now is it's much more that this young person has broader needs than what we're supporting. And we really, if we want to change the behavior, we need to address more of those contextual circumstances and treat the young person like the growing and emerging person they are, who has, all of the potential in the world, if we can just get kind of our response right.
So if a young person is acting out in a school and maybe being disruptive in a class, that is probably a signal that young person is trying to communicate. They may not know how to say it in words, but they have some needs. And that is how it's manifesting itself.
Yeah, and the most effective response is going to be, understood and helpful kind of within that context where it's happening. We're not, somebody in your office is going to have a real hard time understanding what that young person is trying to communicate through some report that comes in that is isolated to this specific behavior that was illegal under some circumstance, right? But that young person's teacher, their family, the young person themselves, if they get to have a, voice within a trusting relationship, can tell you what's happening. And then together that team can figure out what the most appropriate response is going to be.
And the maybe traditional response of we're going to kick you out of school or we're going to do something punitive is not actually addressing why that young person is actually acting out.
Right. And so it might solve the situation for that classroom and that classroom teacher, but it's just sending it to someone else, right? And not actually, so there's going to be another victim somewhere else. There's going to be more harm somewhere else. And so if we're serious about saying, we don't want to send this harm somewhere else, we want to solve the kind of needs that are factoring into the harm, then we really have to take that seriously as a society and say we want to prevent more similar behavior by addressing the underlying needs rather than simply kind of giving a consequence and not addressing the needs and assuming that a young, that it's a character issue rather than an underlying needs issue. And I just think we see over and over again from our recidivism behavior, from our disciplinary response research in schools, that consequences don't solve the problem. Understanding and providing opportunity for meaningful accountability, so a young person really is kind of learning what their emotional, there's a thoughts, feelings, action cycle that we come to understand better and control better as we mature. But there's nothing magical about a consequence that helps a 12-year-old develop a 25-year-old brain in terms of that kind of cognitive, social, and emotional maturity. We have to build that along the way while also addressing the broader context of the harm that happened.
I did an interview with a reporter on Raise the Age and was explaining why that came about, that kind of thing. But one of her questions really struck me in that after we were talking about the needs, that kind of thing, the reporter said to me, but shouldn't there be a consequence or accountability for what this 12-year-old did? And I was a little at a loss to answer that because of what we've been talking about here. That behavior is a manifestation of something that isn't going very well. And so if you're addressing that, what other kind of accountability consequence do we need? But I'm sure you have a much better answer than I do.
Well, I think what I like to do is make sure that we understand that absolutely it needs a response. Mm-hmm. But because our lexicon around behavior is so tied to any response is a consequence, people think when we say it doesn't need punishment, we say we're meaning that it doesn't mean a response. So absolutely that behavior requires a response. That is part of the responsibility of adults in society to figure out how do we respond to this in a way that prevents it from happening again. And what we know about preventing it from happening again is that we have to understand truly the factors that led to that in the first place. And a consequence just doesn't do that. It's too abstract for a 12-year-old to learn from, quite frankly, in terms of their cognitive development. They don't understand why this punishment is related to that behavior, especially, and it doesn't address, a 12-year-old engaging in some big behavior really indicates some deep needs, right? Whether that is that they grew up around some trauma, whether there's, real kind of psychological or social behavioral problems. We need to figure that out and respond accordingly. There are lots of 12-year-olds with those kind of problems who end up in front of a physician, right? Whose parents have the access they need to say, there are some behaviors here that I'm really concerned about. Can we get a full psychological assessment? Some kids, though, end up in front of a prosecutor's office because their parents didn't have access to the kind of behavioral health assessments that they need. And I think that's what we need to take seriously, is that in 10, 11, and 12-year-olds, this kind of behavior requires a medical response, not a prosecutorial response, because you all just don't have the tools that are going to address that appropriately and, for the long-term benefit of society and for that young person and family who have, hopes and dreams that they want to be able to attain, and the right kind of care could help them get there.
I am going to add too, many, and you would say most victims I talk to of behavior from kids that age and even older don't want this to happen again. And so the idea that we as prosecutors are addressing the reason that they're here and hopefully addressing the idea that they won't do it again is really in response to what victims want as well.
Right. Taking seriously the idea that we don't want more victims.
Yes.
We do want you to be made whole, and we can figure that out.
Yes.
But we also want to prevent more of this kind of harm, and we want to take that seriously. Yeah.
So what did you find looking at our data?
Yeah. So when we looked backwards, what we found is some of that old thinking was real present in the decision making around diversion in particular. So we saw, in the many ways we looked at that big data set, that the harshest consequences got the worst outcomes. So, you had multiple diversion tracks, and those all had lower recidivism rates than bringing a kid to court and having them end up on probation or incarceration, which happens in a very small percentage of cases in general in terms of incarceration. But many youths were getting kind of standard probation sentences, and some of those youth had like 50% recidivism rates that were getting probation.
So over half.
Right. So like over half were coming back. So that when I look at that as a citizen, I just think those are the outcomes that I would want our local government agencies to get. We also saw that, much like national research, that the more contact a young person had in the system, the worse their outcomes were. So, young people who had one contact, only 10% of them were coming back within a year. But once they had a second or third, that jumped to 30%. And once it was fourth, it was even higher. So we just had a real failure to intervene effectively. And that really aligns with this idea of escalating consequences, right? Young people would get one kind of opportunity to have their case diverted. And then if they came back, they were much more likely to be charged. So we saw this escalating consequence. We saw offense-based decision-making that was not effective. And so,
say more about that.
Yeah, so having kind of a policy that says, if you have this kind of offense, you're, likely to get diversion. And if you have this kind of offense, you're not.
And they're usually going to be low
level offense, first-time offenses. Those were by far the most likely to get diversion. But then you also had some cases that were maybe on their fourth offense. And so there's this indicator that this is a young person who might have some needs at home. But that fourth offense happened to be like a truancy offense. And so it would go to informal diversion based on the criteria. Well, third offense, so that might happen on. And so based on the criteria of like, this isn't very harmful, there's not much we should do, they would be sent to informal. But actually being on a third offense is an indicator that this young person and their family might need some additional support.
That child isn't in school.
Right. And so, some of that was working. Some of it was young person with serious offenses weren't getting the community supports they need, but young people who maybe didn't have a serious offense in their second or third were also not getting the kind of community supports they need based on the offense rather than based on kind of a deeper understanding of that youth and family. And then I'll say the third thing we found was the effective time. Young people's development is far faster than what we kind of recognize as adults. And so what we're seeing is any month that goes by without seeing a young person reduces the risk that they're ever going to come back again. And so if 6 months goes by and that, between a first and second offense, the chances that young person is going to have a third offense is far, far lower. If a year goes by, it's even lower, right? And so this idea that whatever we do has to be more powerful than the effective time. And we see this in national research, right? Young people outgrow this behavior. Just point blank, whether or not there's any intervention or not, young people mature. We all can recognize that from our own experiences, right? We maybe did some things as young people that we regret now, and we just don't make those same decisions anymore. Our emotional brain caught up with our logical brain, and we age out of that behavior. And so we have to take seriously that if we choose to intervene on a young person's behavior, we have to be more powerful than the effective time itself and the effective. And so we saw that in the data as well, and it really led us to kind of think about how that could be incorporated into some policy decisions.
So what were your recommendations?
Yeah, and so what we really landed on was no more offense-based decision making. We really need to be making decisions about young people, not about their offenses. So person-centered rather than offense-centered decision making. Really expand criteria. Like if community-based responses are clearly our most effective response, right? We controlled for different factors, and we just saw across types of behaviors, types of young people, all that community-based responses were more effective than prosecuting. And so if that's our most effective response, we need to use that more frequently, right? If we're taking serious the idea of increasing public safety, reducing recidivism, then let's make sure our most effective responses are available for more youth. So really expanding our diversion criteria, and then tailoring a little bit our diversion processes too, so that they're more infused with developmental science, so that there's some level of understanding that incorporating this idea of we have to be more effective than time itself. That means that sometimes there's kind of a lighter touch option that kind of assesses a young person's needs and behaviors, and trust that them and their families can tell us what they need, and if that's just some brief intervention, then we go that way. And then also this idea of the opportunity to make things right, so that when a young person really has caused harm, that restorative justice diversion can be a really important opportunity for young people to reckon with the harm they caused and make right, and be supported to make a victim whole, without kind of sending them through a whole pathway that also at the same time is somewhat harmful to them. We can do that in community. We have really solid restorative justice providers here in Hennepin County. And so that's something worth taking advantage of and partnering with them.
I think I recall a story or some data that you were looking at. And there was a case of a young person who was alleged to have stolen a car. And I think it was sitting on the desk of one of our prosecutors and never did get charged. As another young person who had a car theft charged, and the charged young person didn't do as well as the young person whose case was sitting on the desk. Yeah. And I think that's kind of counterintuitive for a lot of people, because I think they would think, oh, the system's response should be this young person took a car, they should be charged, there should be intervention through probation. But as it turns out, the recidivism rates when we handle that situation that way are much higher, even than when it's sitting on our desk and we actually don't intervene at all.
Right. So for example, on third offenses, fourth offenses, you rarely diverted cases. So we couldn't even compare really in at least robust statistical modeling the impact of diversion versus the impact of charging if a young person had been here on a third offense, or for some serious offenses like car theft or gun offenses. And so the only thing we could really compare in a statistical model is whether you charged it or whether you declined the case. And what we saw across multiple analyses was that declining a case got better outcomes than a response. And I think that speaks to this idea of our responses are just not aligned with what young people need. And it also, for the people who but they need something, I think it's important to recognize that young people, almost all young people do have, an ethical core, and that there is a consequence after they, right? Like they feel regret. They learn from that and think, oh, I don't want to be engaged in that, friend group anymore. Or my emotions really got the better of me and I deeply regret what I did and I wish I could make it right. But if I go to this court system and admit to what I did, they're just going to punish me. They're not going to let me make it right. And then that punishment is going to follow me into my 20s, despite what a lot of people think about, juvenile records not following young people into their 20s. And so I think that's part of what we're seeing is just that, I'm not out here advocating nope. So that clearly tells us we don't need to respond to 12-year-olds who are stealing cars. It tells me that we need better responses. We need far better responses. And it appears that those are available in the forms of community-centered diversion responses.
One of the things I hear from some community members is this belief that, well, first of all, my kid knows right from wrong. My kid certainly would have known that was wrong. And I think that's well, I know it's mistaken in that we're not talking about knowing the difference between right and wrong. We're talking about the difference between controlling your impulses, all of the things we know about young people.
Yeah, that harkens back to what I said about the kind of logical part of the brain maturing before the emotional center of the brain. And so a young person, yes, young people know right from wrong, including the young people who end up stealing a car, right? If you ask them beforehand, and if you even ask them afterwards whether that was the right thing to do, they will say, no, it wasn't the right thing to do. But what happens is the emotional center of the brain, which just is kind of backwards in adolescence for reason of developmental and evolutionary science that we can't get into, really just primes the pumps in those like very emotional moments. And it sends the logic brain out the window. And young people get caught up in a scenario and they make the wrong decisions. But it's really more of a stress response than it is an actual rational decision. And so in that stress response where the wrong thing happens, that can happen on a basketball court, or it can happen in a debate where a young person gets caught up, and they could have practiced and practiced and practiced, right? Like free throws. There's a reason we practice and practice and practice, so that when it's time for that winning free throw, your body knows how to do that so that your brain doesn't get in the way. That emotional response, that stress response doesn't just completely derail all the things. Well, young people don't practice being in a situation with their friends when they're going to steal a car. And so the opportunity for that emotional center to just override everything that they know absolutely can happen. And it could happen to any of us when we were 12. The difference between the young person who supposedly knows better is probably their environment is different enough that they didn't end up in a scenario where, car stealing was kind of prevalent among older youth, or, it's really about contextual differences rather than it is more so than it is about kind of individual differences.
My takeaway on this research and practically everything else related to youth is that we can certainly punish them. And that's going to continue to have the same bad outcomes. It's going to create more victims, ruin young people. But if we're really focusing on public safety, we need to address the needs of that young person.
And I would add, it's going to lead to far more expensive outcomes as well, right? And if we invested on the front end in more equal opportunities for, places to live, play, and work, we'd prevent a lot of it. And then in our responses, we can also double down on prevention by absolutely addressing, getting a real understanding of what the needs are, and then addressing those needs to prevent further similar behavior.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
I'm here with Jillian Deese, who's the manager of our Youth Prosecution Division. Welcome, Jillian.
Thank you for having me, Mary.
I had a conversation with Dr. Kara Beckman, and she talked about all the research and the fact that she looked at data from our office for about 8 years. And she talked about what that showed, but you are the person who worked with her to implement that in our office. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, definitely. So our previous diversion criteria, which of course is what allows a youth to be eligible to participate in diversion programming, was fairly limited in scope. It was really offense-based, not person-centered. So in collaborating with Dr. Beckman and her team at the U of M, we were able to, really see what works best for kids. And that included expanding our diversion criteria to include more offense types based on the need of the children, and then to also utilize pre-charge diversion more expansively than we had been with post-charge diversion.
Can you explain the difference between pre-charge diversion and post-charge diversion?
Yeah, so both go through the same initial processing, which is where we have an attorney review to ensure that there's probable cause to support any criminal charges before we decide to intervene with a youth and their family.
Because we're not going to go ahead. If there isn't probable cause, we're going to decline because
that is correct. If they're correct. So pre-charge diversion would be that we make that analysis at the front end to decide that we can divert it prior to filing any type of criminal charge in court. Post-charge diversion would include the filing of a criminal petition in court. Generally, those are reserved for cases where maybe the youth has already engaged in pre-charge diversion one or two times before and really needs that court oversight to keep them on track. We have learned in collaboration with Dr. Beckman and her team that we see the best outcomes by utilizing pre-charge diversion because, as we know, any contact with the legal system actually increases a youth's risk for recidivism and leads to worse outcomes in the future.
And you mentioned expanding the list of offenses and making it about the person and not the offense. One really fascinating thing Dr. Beckman talked about was the fact that you might have a young person on something very minor, truancy, which actually means the child isn't in school. But even though the court system might consider that a really minor offense, that may be an indication that that young person has a lot of needs.
Exactly. And we were finding that repeatedly and kind of anecdotally with our attorneys that we would have these really low level of interventions for kids that actually had really high needs and needed more intensive engagement. I mean, similarly, we would find that youth who committed really serious offenses who had previously been excluded from diversion programming, maybe it was a one-time mistake. Maybe it was a kid who actually did have a lot of support in the community from their family and didn't require as much intervention and services. And they're brought into this court system and we're almost overly intervening in a way that is not beneficial to them or to the community in terms of long-term public safety.
How has the implementation gone?
I would say really well. I want to commend all of the staff in youth prosecution, from the attorneys who make the decision, the paralegals that support them, the legal secretaries who process those cases, and our diversion coordinators who communicate directly with the families and with diversion providers. It has required a lot of internal system changes, but I really feel like we're in a good place to know how better to streamline our processes. I will say in terms of buy-in from our staff, people are on board. They know that this type of programming really does work. We've seen it. We were also really lucky to have Dr. Beckman and her team provide training to our staff on multiple occasions. They have provided training to our diversion providers. So we really feel like we have a foundation to support this work in the future.
I was particularly interested when I looked at her research in the idea that a case that sat on our desk about a young person who was alleged to commit a crime, we didn't do anything with that case, or we declined it. That young person actually did better than, in many situations, than a young person whose case we charged who went through the traditional system.
I know, isn't that fascinating?
Yes.
So we know from developmental science, like Dr. Beckman pointed out, that sometimes, most of the time, all of this risk-taking behavior is very normative. All kids do it. And sometimes formal interventions are not necessary. I will also say one of the benefits to this diversion, especially on our pre-charge end, is we're able to intervene more quickly. We can make those decisions faster. We can get the youth and family connected to services faster, because we also know that if a kid does require intervention, the more immediate it is to the harm that was caused, the more effective the outcome will be.
Do we have any early data on it?
That's a great question. So it's a little early to track recidivism rates, but I would say a good measure is our participation rates with families and youth. And our primary diversion provider has indicated that their participation rates, their engagement rates is close to 90%, which is huge. I think it speaks to how youth and families are really ready for this. One thing I wanted to point out is that diversion programming is really family driven. It's really collaborative with the youth, the family, even community in creating a service plan that is very attuned and tailored to the youth's actual needs. That's very different than the formal court system, which is imposed disposition. The conditions are usually determined by the attorneys who might not know the kid and family that well. So I would say the participation rates are a good measure of how families and kids are ready to engage.
And looking at our earlier data, the young people who completed diversion had far less, I don't know, the people who didn't went through the regular system or who didn't complete diversion had higher recidivism rates. So that's a really positive sign.
Definitely. And we are utilizing pre-charge diversion more expansively than we ever have. And again, based on the U of M's, almost 8 years worth of data to review, really highlighted to us that pre-charge diversion is what is most effective.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I'm here with Chris Guy. He is one of our youth diversion providers. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you for having me today.
Can you tell people a little bit about your background?
Born and raised south side of Chicago. I've been living in Minnesota for 5 years, and I have been a restorative practitioner for almost 2 decades. Restorative justice advocate for over 2 decades. And I connect with people, organizations, and community through love. It's something that I'm very passionate about. It's something that I advocate for through public policy and policy reform, as well as a service provider.
So as a service provider, you actually work with Kente Circle and North Point.
Yes.
And can you, so North Point is one of our diversion providers for young people. And I think when people hear restorative practices, they're not always understanding what that looks like. What does it look like when a youth is diverted to North Point?
What that looks like is partnership. It's about meeting people where they are, establishing the connection, but not just focusing on the issue rather than the person holistically. The issue is the issue. The person is not the issue. And when we meet people where they are and focus on how we can help each other, I believe that that is the founding principle and fundamental building blocks of any partnership and relationship. Oftentimes, we are faced with the mitigating circumstances of not knowing how the youth came to be in our presence as service providers and practitioners. And I think that it's easy to overlook their humanity because we are not always met as people with compassion and empathy. All of us were children at some point in time. And have we gotten so far on our journeys that we have forgotten where we come from and what we've been through as individuals and people? So I do not distinguish a disconnection with youth. They are our youth, right? They're our youth. And when they fail, we fail as a community.
And that means all of our youth.
All of our youth. I work with everybody. I work with all youth.
And what you're talking about with relationships is really important because kids, young people are much more accountable to relationships than they are to rules. And so that connection with somebody else who cares about them is really critically important.
When I think about accountability, my conventional approach or definition of accountability is, acknowledge that you made a mistake and that you did wrong, right? Through my years of practice, I have developed a modality and framework to approach people by understanding and acknowledging that accountability can be acknowledging that harm was caused and done. It doesn't necessarily differentiate or distinguish between offender and victim, because if there is an offense that has occurred, there is a victim, there is harm to the families of the offender, there's harm to the families of the victim, there's harm to the community as a whole, there's harm to the system, right? No one wins. No one wins.
There is also, we see this all the time, but somebody who is a victim who has been harmed is sometimes then going to be somebody who harms somebody else.
Hurt people hurt people.
Hurt people hurt people. So what does it look like for a young person who's diverted to your program?
Welcoming them. Most programs have an approach of this is mandated and this is a requirement. That may be true for some programs and not all programs, but to welcome them, to invite them into a space, right? Communally, right? They're a part of the community. They're not separated from the community because of an error in judgment or misguidedness. They're still a part of the community. They are not separated from the community. So how do we still establish the unifying connection to the community? And it's meeting them where they are. It's not focusing on the issue because the issue is the issue. The issue is not the person, right? Those are mitigating circumstances that guides someone's behavior based upon learned and lived experiences and influences. So that's why restorative practices versus punitive measures is one of the founding fundamental pillars of restorative practice.
It's also important for young people to feel that people care about them. And it's important from a diversion perspective, as we've learned through research. It's got to be tailored to the individual young person. And that's, I think, what you're saying is meeting where they are.
Programs can have a general outline and framework. The practitioner's responsibility is to learn the person through compassion, through empathy, with understanding. So every curriculum, every approach is tailored to this individual. There's a general outline for everything in the world, right? Our society is a general outline, but what shapes our society to give it a heart is how we show up for each other in community. So how I show up with my youth, with my community, and I say mine because of, not because of ownership, but because of partnership. I show up with an open heart. I take everything personal. I just don't take it to heart.
Mm-hmm.
And seeing where these youth come from, some of the mitigating circumstances such as instability in housing, lack of job security and gainful employment, lack of community support, lack of resources to access secondary education. These are the mitigating circumstances that actually perpetuate the cycle and actually contribute to recidivism. And it's not just the youth, it's all adults too. Formerly incarcerated persons that have been encountered the criminal justice system.
So you have to meet the young person where they are, and you have to get to know them, or let them get to know you, get to know them, to even figure out what those needs are.
Absolutely. You should want to know someone, right? I get excited when I meet a stranger, right? It's a clean canvas, it's a blank slate, right? Coming in here today, I'm like, who am I going to get to meet, right?
Mm-hmm.
What am I going to get to learn? And how can I share what I've acquired in my time to give a gift, right? Give something worth meaning. I've learned from youth, from people from community, that the acknowledgement of harm requires vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
And most of those conversations do not begin with the harm that was done to someone else. I try to start the conversation about what has happened to you, right? Because the surface of what was done to someone else is a reaction, right? That's the effect. But what was the cause? What are the conditions of the environment that this child is being raised in, right? Who is influencing them? Who's guiding them? What do they have to deal with every day? In community, I believe when a child fails, I fail personally. That's accountability. Through restorative leadership, I teach community. Yes, it is about what has occurred, but how did we get here? Was it just all of a sudden? What was the influence? What was the thing that you don't want to say out loud? And that takes transparency.
What kind of progress have you seen in young people that you've worked with?
Oh, breakthroughs. I've seen the type of breakthroughs where kids that are so guarded, they can't crack a smile. And through some of my approaches and frameworks that I use as a practitioner with youth and case manager is community engagement activities, right? I take them out to Mall of America, we get a bite to eat, or I take them to vertical endeavors and we do indoor rock climbing. I do circle facilitation, right? I do academic support planning where I go to their schools, I meet with their teachers. I sit down and find out from them, the youth, our youth that I work with, What do they need? Where are they struggling? I do circle facilitation with the families. I do mentoring and coaching. All of these applications are needed. There is not one application that can grow into a progressive outcome without the integration of all components, right? Again, presence. So what I have seen, I have a youth that that received a Student of the Month award. He was struggling with chemistry for like 2 or 3 quarters. And we stayed on top of it. We stayed on top of it. And then I called him just to do my weekly check-in. I just said, hey, what's going on? He's just like, hey, I just want to let you know I finally passed chemistry and I made a Student of the Month award. And I cried. He couldn't tell on the phone that I was crying, but I cried because I'm like, that's what conviction looks like. And not conviction of you are found guilty because of the crime you committed. Conviction because of your ability to follow through with your commitment. Those type of success stories are not often disclosed, discussed, or shared. And I'm not gonna say his name, but you know who he is.
Yeah, that reminds me that when I look at young people who come through the system, particularly ones that have done something that's been highly publicized, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I get updates on how they're doing, and they are doing so well by and large, really, really well.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't talk about that, nor would you want to talk about that. I mean, a young person's living their life, but I often wish we could find a way to talk successfully to the public about, hey, when you give young people the support services that they need, they generally thrive. And to me, that's about public safety.
Something that I've often seen time and time again is youth that have entered diversion programs multiple times. So the thing that I began to inquire about from their perspective and learned experience was, what was it like? What were the other programs like, right? So what that teaches me is what they've encountered, and I can develop an application and framework that can evolve that experience. A lot of the times I've seen that there is an inadequate training guideline and standard, right? What that means in my interpretation, in my humble opinion, is people should be trained to learn and know how to approach people as service providers and practitioners in the most conducive way of the partnership, i.e., meaning my way is not the only way, right? My applications will not work with anyone that I work with, first and foremost, if they do not receive it. So that requires vulnerability, right? The transparency component is them accepting and acknowledging the help and support that they require. I can't project it on them. I won't force it on them. But training the people, the staff, the practitioners, the service providers, the case managers, that is as equally as important as being in the position to be the persons or organization that encounter the community, right? That's an equitable investment. And a lot of people should want to learn more about how to best show up for the community that we all should love and serve.
Especially our young people.
These kids need a safe space. They need a safe space, and they need people that would meet them without judgment, that would meet them without ridicule, and just an open-mindedness. It's not about where they've been. It's not about focusing on the potential that they have of where we want to see them go. It's about meeting them where they are, right in that present moment. But what does that look like for us? How do we become better at that? How do we grow together?
Thank you for your work, Chris.
I appreciate you.
You heard from Dr. Cara Beckman, Jillian Deese, and Chris Guy, who all talked about our different approach to diversion for young people. Dr. Beckman talked about how the research showed us that what we were doing for the last 8 to 10 years simply did not work for public safety. But what we're doing now has promising results. So this is a good example of how we don't have to choose. We don't have to choose between research and actually changing what we're doing when we learn what actually works better to help young people thrive. That is about public safety. Thank you for joining us.